Maggie Chen had stopped believing in miracles when she was 8 years old. That was the day in 1953 when two uniformed officers knocked on their door in San Francisco's Chinatown and told her family that her brother Thomas had been killed in action in Korea. She remembered her mother's scream, a sound so primal it seemed to come from the earth itself. She remembered her father's face turning to stone. She remembered her older sister Ruth collapsing on the floor. And she remembered thinking, with the cold clarity of a child forced to grow up too fast, God doesn't care about people like us. Now, 70 years later, at 78 years old, Maggie stood in her cluttered apartment in the Sunset District, staring at a photograph that threatened to resurrect every miracle she'd ever stopped believing in. The photo had arrived that morning in an unmarked manila envelope with no return address. Just her name and address typed on a label, a San Francisco postmark from 3 days ago. Inside was a single black and white photograph, slightly faded but clear enough. It showed an elderly Asian man, maybe in his late 80s, sitting on a porch somewhere rural. Mountains in the background, a rocking chair, a small dog at his feet. He was smiling at the camera, his face deeply lined but somehow familiar. Taped to the back of the photo was a torn piece of paper with 3 words written in shaky handwriting. Thomas Chen. Alive. Maggie's hands trembled as she held the photograph up to the light. The man in the picture had her brother's nose. Her brother's smile. Her brother's eyes. But that was impossible. Thomas had died in 1953. They'd had a funeral with a flag-draped coffin. Her parents had mourned him for the rest of their lives, her mother until 1998, her father until 2003. The government had sent a death certificate, military honors, survivor benefits. Dead men didn't sit on porches with dogs. Dead men didn't smile for cameras 70 years after they were supposed to have died. Maggie picked up her phone and called the only person who would understand. Ruth. It's Maggie. Can you come over? Now. It's about Tommy. Ruth Chen Williams arrived 40 minutes later, out of breath from climbing the stairs to Maggie's third-floor apartment. At 82, Ruth was 4 years older than Maggie, with silver hair cut short and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She'd been a high school principal before retiring 15 years ago, and she still carried that aura of authority that made people straighten their posture when she entered a room. This better be good, Ruth said, collapsing into Maggie's worn armchair. I was in the middle of my pottery class. Maggie handed her the photograph without a word. Ruth looked at it. Frowned. Looked closer. Her face went very still. Where did you get this? Her voice was barely above a whisper. It came in the mail this morning. No return address. Just that. Ruth flipped it over, read the note. Her hands started shaking. Maggie, this is cruel. Someone is playing a sick joke on us. Is it? Maggie asked. Look at his face, Ruth. Really look at it. Ruth stared at the photograph for a long time. It looks like him. But that's impossible. Tommy died in Korea. We got the telegram. We had the funeral. Did we ever see a body? What? Did we ever actually see Tommy's body? Maggie pressed. They sent back a sealed coffin. They said it was him, but we never looked inside. What if they were wrong? Ruth set down the photograph carefully, as if it might explode. Maggie, you're talking about a military cover-up spanning 70 years. The government doesn't make mistakes like that. Doesn't it? What about all those POWs they said didn't exist? What about the soldiers who came home decades later? What about? Those were Vietnam. Korea was different. Was it? The sisters stared at each other across Maggie's cluttered living room. Two elderly women confronting a possibility that seemed both impossible and terrifyingly real. Even if, Ruth said slowly, and I mean even if this man is Tommy, why would he wait 70 years to make contact? Why now? Why like this, with an anonymous photograph? Maybe he didn't send it, Maggie said. Maybe someone else did. Someone who knows something. Or maybe it's a scam. Maybe someone wants money. Maybe they're preying on elderly women who lost family members. To what end? There's no ransom note. No request for money. Just a photograph. Ruth picked it up again, studying every detail. Where do you think this was taken? Somewhere rural. Mountains. Could be anywhere from Montana to North Carolina. The dog's wearing a collar. There's a house number partially visible on that mailbox in the background. Looks like a 6 and a 3. The mountains. Ruth squinted. Those look like the Appalachians. The way they're layered, the vegetation. I'd guess somewhere in the mid-Atlantic. Maybe West Virginia or Virginia. Maggie looked at her sister with newfound respect. When did you become a detective? I taught geography for 40 years. You pick things up. Ruth set down the photo. So what do you want to do? I want to find him. Maggie. I want to find out if our brother is alive. And if he is, I want to know why he let us think he was dead for 70 years. Ruth was quiet for a long time. Then, this could break your heart. Again. My heart's been broken since I was 8 years old. At least this way I'll know for sure. Ruth studied her younger sister, still fierce, still stubborn, still carrying the grief of a little girl who'd lost her big brother. Okay, Ruth said finally. Okay. We find him. Together. But we do this smart. We don't go rushing into anything. We investigate first. How? Ruth pulled out her phone. We start with what we know. We find out everything we can about what really happened to Thomas Chen in Korea. They started at the National Archives branch in San Bruno, south of San Francisco. Ruth had made an appointment with a research specialist named David Park, a young man in his 30s who greeted them with enthusiasm and genuine curiosity. Korean War records, he said, pulling up files on his computer. What's the name? Thomas Jonathan Chen, Maggie said. Killed in action, 1953. We're trying to find his service records, circumstances of death, anything you have. David typed quickly, then frowned. That's odd. What? Both sisters leaned forward. His file is restricted. That's unusual for someone who died 70 years ago. Most Korean War records have been declassified. What does restricted mean? Ruth demanded. It means there's information in his file that the government still considers sensitive. Could be a lot of things, intelligence operations, classified missions, diplomatic complications. He looked up at them. Was your brother involved in anything unusual? Special operations. Intelligence work. The sisters looked at each other. He was 19 years old, Maggie said. He'd barely finished high school when he enlisted. How would we know if he was involved in special operations? David nodded sympathetically. Let me see what I can access without clearance. He typed for several minutes, occasionally making notes. Finally he turned his monitor so they could see. Okay, here's what I can tell you. Thomas Chen, born 1934, enlisted 1952, deployed to Korea with the 2nd Infantry Division in early 1953. He was reported missing in action on March 15, 1953, during fighting near the Imjin River. His status was changed to presumed killed in action 6 months later in September 1953. Presumed? Ruth said sharply. Not confirmed. That's not unusual. Lots of soldiers were declared presumed dead when bodies couldn't be recovered. The fighting was chaotic, especially in the last months before the armistice. But you said restricted, Maggie pressed. Why would a regular infantry soldier's records be restricted? David hesitated. I shouldn't speculate, but there were incidents during the Korean War. POWs who chose not to return. Soldiers who defected. Chinese and North Korean prisoners who stayed in South Korea. It was complicated. The Cold War politics made everything sensitive. You're saying Tommy might have defected? Maggie's voice rose. To North Korea. That's insane. I'm not saying anything definite. I'm just explaining why records might still be classified. There could be a dozen other reasons. Ruth put a hand on Maggie's arm. Is there any way to get access to the restricted portions? You'd need to file a Freedom of Information Act request. Could take months, maybe years. And they might still deny it if there are legitimate national security concerns. We don't have years, Maggie said quietly. David looked at the two elderly women, saw the desperation in their faces, and made a decision. Look, I'm not supposed to do this, but there's an organization. Korean War Veterans Advocacy Group. They help families get information about missing soldiers, push for declassification of records, that kind of thing. They have connections, ex-military people who know how to navigate the system. He wrote down a name and phone number. Call this guy. Tell him I sent you. He might be able to help. Ruth took the paper. Thank you. Outside the archives, standing in the parking lot, Maggie turned to her sister. He defected. Tommy defected to North Korea or China, and the government covered it up to spare our family the shame. We don't know that, Ruth said, but her voice lacked conviction. What else could it be? Restricted files. Presumed dead. Ruth, what if Tommy chose not to come home? Then why would someone send us this photograph now? Ruth held up her phone, where she'd taken a picture of the original photo. Why tell us he's alive if he's been in North Korea for 70 years? Maggie had no answer. The man David Park had recommended was named Frank Castellano, a retired army colonel who now ran a non-profit helping families find information about Korean War MEAs. They met him at a diner in Oakland, halfway between their homes. Frank was in his 70s, with a military bearing he'd probably never lose and kind eyes that had seen too much. Tell me everything, he said after they'd ordered coffee. They told him. About the photograph, about the restricted records, about 70 years of believing Thomas was dead. Frank studied the photograph carefully, then pulled out a magnifying glass from his briefcase, an actual magnifying glass, like something from a detective novel, and examined every detail. The dog's collar has a tag, he murmured. Can't read it, but it's there. The mailbox number is 632. The mountains. Yeah, those are Appalachians. I'd guess Virginia or West Virginia, maybe eastern Kentucky. He looked up. And you have no idea who sent this? None, Maggie said. Have you received anything else? Other letters? Phone calls? No, just the photograph. Frank sat back, thinking. Okay, here's what I can tell you. During the Korean War, there were approximately 7,800 Americans who were listed as missing or unaccounted for. Of those, several hundred were believed to be alive in POW camps but were never returned. The government officially says all POWs were repatriated, but... He paused. There were rumors. Stories. Men who chose not to come back. Men who were held in secret camps. Men who were brainwashed or turned. The truth is murky. Was Tommy one of them? Ruth asked. I can find out. Or I can try. But I need you to understand something. If your brother was alive all these years and chose not to contact you, that's going to hurt. If he defected, that's going to raise questions about loyalty and treason. Are you prepared for that? Maggie met his eyes. I'm prepared to know the truth. Okay then. Frank pulled out a laptop. Let's start digging. Over the next week, Frank worked his contacts. He called former military intelligence officers. He reached out to historians specializing in the Korean War. He even contacted someone at the CIA, off the record, using favors owed from his military days. The sisters waited. Maggie couldn't sleep. Ruth stress-cleaned her entire house twice. They talked on the phone every night, speculating, hoping, fearing. Finally, Frank called them back to the diner. I found something, he said without preamble. It's not pretty. Both sisters leaned forward. Thomas Chen was captured by Chinese forces on March 15, 1953, during a retreat near the Imjin River. There's a classified report, and I'm not supposed to know this, so it never came from me, that says he was held in a POW camp in northern Korea with about 50 other Americans. But they said he was killed in action, Maggie protested. The military lied. They did that sometimes. When the armistice was signed in July 1953, all POWs were supposed to be repatriated. But 21 Americans refused to come home. They chose to stay in China and North Korea. The words hung in the air like smoke. Tommy was one of them. Ruth's voice was barely a whisper. No, Frank said. That's the weird part. Thomas Chen isn't on the official list of defectors. But there's a notation in the classified file that says special circumstances. See attached. And the attachment is redacted. Completely blacked out. What does that mean? Maggie demanded. I don't know. But I have a theory. Frank pulled out a map of East Asia. There were rumors, unconfirmed, but persistent, that some American POWs were sent to Soviet Russia for interrogation. Scientists, engineers, anyone with potentially valuable knowledge. They were never officially POWs. They just disappeared. Tommy was 19, Ruth said. He wasn't a scientist or engineer. No, but he was Chinese American. Fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese. During the war, Chinese American soldiers were incredibly valuable as interpreters and intelligence assets. If the Chinese or Russians wanted someone who could navigate between cultures. He trailed off meaningfully. Maggie felt sick. You're saying the Soviets took him? I'm saying it's possible. And if that's what happened, he might have been held for years. By the time he was released, if he was released, he might have been presumed dead. He might have had no way to contact home. He might have. Frank hesitated. He might have been broken. Mentally. Physically. PTSD wasn't understood back then. If he came back damaged, he might have felt he couldn't face his family. But he's alive now, Maggie said, tapping the photograph. Alive, and someone wants us to know it. Which brings us to the big question, Frank said. Who sent you this picture, and why now? That question was answered 3 days later when Maggie received a phone call. The voice on the other end was female, elderly, with a slight Appalachian accent. Is this Margaret Chen? Yes. Who is this? My name is Dorothy Miller. I'm calling about the photograph I sent you. About Thomas. Maggie's heart stopped. She fumbled for the speaker button so Ruth, who was visiting, could hear. You sent it. Why? Who are you? I'm Thomas's wife, Dorothy said simply. Well, common-law wife. We've been together for 43 years. The sisters stared at each other in shock. Where is he? Maggie demanded. Is he really alive? Is he okay? He's alive, but he's not okay. He has dementia. Advanced. He's been in decline for about 2 years now, and lately he's been talking about his sisters. About Margaret and Ruth. About San Francisco. About how he never got to say goodbye. Tears were streaming down Maggie's face. Why didn't he contact us before? Why did he let us think he was dead for 70 years? Dorothy was quiet for a moment. That's a long story. One I think Thomas should tell you himself, while he still can. He has good days and bad days. Today's a good day. If you want to talk to him, I can put him on the phone. Or. She paused. Or you could come here. To West Virginia. See him in person before it's too late. Ruth grabbed Maggie's hand. We'll come. Tell us where. Dorothy gave them an address in a small town called Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. It's not easy to find. Rural. But if you can get here, I think Thomas needs to see you. To know you're real. Sometimes he thinks you're ghosts. Memories. He needs to know he's forgiven. Forgiven for what? Maggie asked. For surviving, Dorothy said softly. For not dying like he was supposed to. For building a life when everyone thought he was gone. For being afraid to come home. They flew to Washington, D.C. the next day and rented a car. The drive to Harper's Ferry took about an hour, winding through increasingly rural countryside. Neither sister spoke much. They were both processing, preparing, hoping, and fearing in equal measure. What if he doesn't recognize us? Maggie finally asked as they crossed into West Virginia. He probably won't, Ruth said practically. We were 8 and 12 when he left. We're 78 and 82 now. We look nothing like the little girls he knew. But he talked about us. Dorothy said he talks about us. Memory is strange, especially with dementia. He might remember the past but not recognize the present. The address Dorothy had given them led to a small white farmhouse on a country road, surrounded by mountains. There was a garden out front, a mailbox with 632 on it, and on the porch, a rocking chair. The same rocking chair from the photograph. They parked and sat in the car for a moment, neither moving. "Are you ready?" Ruth asked. "No," Maggie admitted. "But let's go anyway." The front door opened before they could knock. A woman in her early 80s stood there, tall, thin, with white hair pulled back in a practical bun. She had kind eyes and work-worn hands. "You must be Margaret and Ruth," she said. "I'm Dorothy. Thank you for coming." She led them inside. The house was small but immaculate, decorated with handmade quilts and photographs. Maggie noticed they were all recent. None showed Thomas as a young man. As if that person had never existed. "He's in the back room," Dorothy said. "His bedroom. He has trouble with stairs now, so we moved everything downstairs. I should warn you, he's not the man you remember. Time and everything he went through, it changed him." "We understand," Ruth said. Dorothy led them down a short hallway to a sunny bedroom. In a chair by the window sat an elderly Asian man, thin and frail, with silver hair and clouded eyes. He was looking out at the mountains, humming something tunelessly. "Thomas," Dorothy said gently. "You have visitors. Your sisters are here. Margaret and Ruth came all the way from California to see you." The old man turned slowly. His eyes, milky with cataracts, tried to focus on them. For a moment his face was blank. Then something flickered, recognition or memory or hope. "Maggie." His voice was rough, uncertain. "Ruthie." Maggie couldn't help it. She burst into tears and rushed forward, kneeling beside his chair. "Tommy. It's me. It's really me. We're here." Thomas raised a shaking hand and touched her face, wonderingly. "You're old," he said, and then laughed, a sound so unexpected it startled them all. "We're all so old. How did that happen?" "Time happened," Ruth said, moving to his other side. 70 years of it. Thomas looked between them, his eyes filling with tears. "I thought you'd hate me. I thought I was supposed to die. The government said I died. It seemed easier to stay dead." "Tell us," Maggie said, taking his hand. "Tell us what happened. Please." Thomas's story came out in fragments, confused sometimes, jumping between decades. Dorothy sat nearby, occasionally filling in gaps or correcting details gently. He'd been captured by Chinese forces in March 1953, just months before the war ended. The POW camp had been brutal: starvation, torture, psychological warfare. They'd tried to break the prisoners, turn them against America. "But I didn't break," Thomas said proudly. "I never broke. I wanted to come home. I wanted to see you again." But then something had gone wrong during the prisoner exchange. Thomas had been loaded on a truck with other POWs, supposedly heading to the repatriation point. Instead, the truck had turned north. "They took us to China," Thomas said. "A secret facility. There were Russians there. American POWs they wanted to keep. The ones who knew things or could be useful." "But what did you know?" Ruth asked. "You were just an infantryman." "I spoke Mandarin," Thomas said simply. "My mother taught me. They wanted me to help with interrogations. To translate. To make other prisoners talk." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I refused. So they kept me. Punishment. To break me." He'd spent 8 years in various prisons and labor camps, moved from facility to facility, his existence never officially acknowledged. By the time the Chinese finally released him in 1961, part of a quiet diplomatic arrangement that was never made public, everyone thought he was dead. "I was released in Hong Kong," Thomas continued. "They gave me papers, some money, and told me to disappear. I tried to contact the American embassy, but..." He looked away. "They said I didn't exist. Said there was no record of a Thomas Chen being held as a POW. They thought I was a spy or a defector trying to infiltrate. They wouldn't help me. So what did you do? Maggie asked. I came back to America on my own. Worked on cargo ships. Took me almost a year. When I finally got to San Francisco in 1962, I went to Chinatown. To our old neighborhood. He paused, his face crumpling with old grief. You'd moved, he whispered. The house was gone. Everything was different. I asked around, but nobody knew where the Chen family went. And I was so broken, Maggie. I had nightmares every night. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I was afraid of crowds. I was afraid of everything. You were traumatized, Ruth said softly. I was broken, Thomas repeated. And I thought maybe it was better if I stayed dead. You'd already mourned me. You'd already moved on. Why bring back a ghost? Why make you deal with someone who was so damaged? So you just disappeared. Maggie couldn't keep the hurt from her voice. I wandered, Thomas said. Worked odd jobs. Moved from place to place. Eventually ended up in West Virginia in 1980. Met Dorothy. She was a widow. I was a ghost. We understood each other. Dorothy spoke up. He told me everything after we'd been together for about a year. I wanted him to contact his family, but he was so afraid. Afraid you'd hate him. Afraid you'd be ashamed. Afraid you wouldn't believe him. We would have believed him, Ruth said. We would have understood. Would you? Thomas asked. Really? I let you think I was dead for almost 30 years by then. I missed your weddings. Your children. Your lives. How do you forgive that? They stayed in Harper's Ferry for 3 days. Dorothy had a guest room where they slept, taking turns sitting with Thomas, listening to his stories, filling in the gaps of their own lives. The dementia made conversations difficult. He'd sometimes forget they were there, sometimes think they were still children, sometimes confuse the present with the past. But there were moments of clarity. Beautiful moments when he was fully present, fully himself. On the second day, Maggie brought out old photographs she'd carried with her. Pictures of their parents, their childhood home in Chinatown, their family before the war. Thomas held them with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face. Mama, he whispered, touching a photo of their mother. She was so beautiful. Was she happy? After? No, Maggie said honestly. She never recovered from losing you. It broke something in her. But she survived. She lived until 1998. She got to meet some of her grandchildren. Did she hate me? She never knew you were alive to hate, Ruth said. She mourned you until the day she died. Thomas closed his eyes. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. We know, Maggie said. We understand why you didn't come back. But Tommy, why now? Why did Dorothy contact us now? Thomas looked at Dorothy, who nodded encouragingly. Because I'm dying, he said simply. The dementia is getting worse. I have maybe a year. Maybe less. And I realized I couldn't die without you knowing the truth. Without you knowing I loved you. That I thought about you every day. That I never forgot. We never forgot either, Maggie said, her voice breaking. There wasn't a day I didn't think about you. Didn't wonder what you'd be like if you'd lived. And you did live, Tommy. You survived. You built a life. You loved someone. That's not something to be ashamed of. But I abandoned you. You were captured. Imprisoned. Traumatized. That's not abandonment, that's survival. Ruth leaned forward. Tommy, listen to me. We don't blame you. We never blamed you. We just missed you. So damn much. Thomas wept then, and his sisters wept with him, 70 years of grief and loss and love pouring out in Dorothy's sunny bedroom with the mountains watching through the window. On the third day, Thomas had a bad day. He didn't recognize them, kept asking for Dorothy, grew agitated and confused. Dorothy explained this was normal, that the bad days were becoming more frequent. You should go, she said gently. Before it gets harder. He won't understand if you stay. He'll just be confused and upset. But we just found him, Maggie protested. I know. But you found him in time. That's what matters. You got to talk to him. To hear his story. To tell him you forgive him. That's the gift. Before they left, Dorothy gave them something, a small wooden box. Thomas made these, she said. When his hand still worked well. He carved them from memory. He never showed them to anyone but me. Inside were 3 small wooden figures, beautifully detailed. A woman in a traditional Chinese dress with her hair in a bun. A teenage girl with braids. A little girl with a ponytail. Mama, you, and me, Maggie whispered. He carved them in 1985, Dorothy said. Said he wanted something physical to remember you by. Said he was afraid his memory would fade and he'd lose you again. He kept them on his nightstand for almost 40 years. Can we? Ruth started. Keep them, Dorothy said. He'd want you to have them. And I have something else. She handed them a journal, worn, filled with Thomas's handwriting, though increasingly shaky in recent entries. His memories. Everything he remembered about you, about your childhood, about his time in Korea and after. He's been writing it down for decades, afraid he'd forget. Now it's yours. They left Harper's Ferry that afternoon, promising to call, to visit again before the end. In the car, heading back toward Washington, neither sister spoke for miles. Finally, Maggie broke the silence. We lost 70 years with him. But we got 3 days, Ruth countered. 3 days we thought we'd never have. 3 days to say goodbye properly. To understand. To forgive. Is it enough? Ruth thought about it. No. But it's more than we had before. And sometimes, more than nothing is all you get. Maggie opened the journal Dorothy had given them and began reading aloud. Thomas's memories, written in his own hand, preserved against the erosion of time and trauma and dementia. March 1953. The day I was captured, all I could think about was my little sisters. Maggie with her pigtails always askew. Ruth with her serious face, always protecting Maggie. I thought, I need to survive this. I need to get back to them. I held on to that thought through everything that came after. Through the camps, the interrogations, the years of being lost. That thought kept me alive. My sisters. My family. Home. Maggie's voice broke, but she kept reading. 1962. I'm back in America, but I'm a ghost. I went to Chinatown today. Our house is gone. You're gone. I stood on the corner of Grant and Washington for 3 hours, just standing there, hoping I'd see someone I recognized. But San Francisco has changed. Or maybe I've changed too much to belong anywhere anymore. 1980. I met a woman today. Her name is Dorothy. She doesn't ask too many questions. Doesn't push. I think maybe I could build something with her. Not a family. I had a family, and I lost them. But something. A life. Even ghosts need a place to rest. 2005. I'm getting old. My hands shake. My memory isn't what it was. I think about Maggie and Ruth every day. Wonder if they're still alive. Wonder if they have grandchildren. Wonder if they ever think about their brother who died in Korea. Except I didn't die. I'm here. Still here. Still loving them. Still sorry. 2023. Dorothy wants to find my sisters. She says I talk about them in my sleep. Says I cry out their names. She thinks I need closure before I die. But how do you get closure for 70 years of absence? How do you apologize for being a ghost? The last entry was dated 3 weeks ago. The fog is getting thicker. Some days I don't remember yesterday. But I always remember Maggie and Ruth. Always remember being 12 years old, teaching Maggie to ride a bike, Ruth reading to us under the covers after lights out. Always remember being 19, shipping out to Korea, turning back one last time to wave. They were standing on the dock, crying. I promised I'd come home. I broke that promise. But maybe, somehow, before I'm gone completely, I can tell them I tried. I tried so hard to come home. Maggie closed the journal, unable to continue. He tried, she whispered. He really tried. I know, Ruth said. They drove in silence, two elderly women carrying the weight of 70 years of missing, now finally, impossibly, found. Thomas Chen died 6 months later, peacefully in his sleep, with Dorothy holding his hand. Maggie and Ruth flew back to West Virginia for the funeral. It was small, just Dorothy, her adult children from her first marriage, a few neighbors, and Thomas's sisters. They buried him in a small cemetery outside Harper's Ferry, with a military honor guard that Frank Castellano had arranged. The government officially recognized Thomas's service, his POW status, and his survival, a quiet acknowledgement, decades too late, but an acknowledgement nonetheless. On his headstone, they inscribed, Thomas Jonathan Chen 1934 to 2024 beloved brother, husband, survivor you are finally home. After the service, Dorothy pulled the sisters aside. I have something for you, she said, handing them a letter. Thomas wrote this on one of his last good days. He wanted you to have it. The letter was brief, written in shaky handwriting. Dear Maggie and Ruth. Thank you for coming. Thank you for forgiving me. Thank you for understanding. I want you to know that even though I couldn't come home, part of me never left. Every choice I made, every day I survived, I did it carrying you with me. You were my home. You always were. I'm sorry I couldn't be the brother you deserved. I'm sorry I couldn't watch you grow up, couldn't meet your families, couldn't be there for all the moments that mattered. But I'm grateful. Grateful that you found me before the end. Grateful that you didn't hate me. Grateful that I got to see your faces one more time and know that you were real, not just memories fading in the fog. Take care of each other. Keep telling my story. And remember, I loved you. From Korea to China to West Virginia to whatever comes next, I loved you. Your brother, Tommy. 6 months after Thomas's death, Maggie and Ruth published his journal. They titled it The Ghost Brother, a Korean War story of survival and loss. It became a modest success, especially among Korean War veterans' families. It opened conversations about POWs who never came home, about the psychological cost of war, about the complexity of survival and the impossibility of returning to a life that had moved on without you. Frank Castellano used Thomas's story to push for more declassification of Korean War records. Several other families came forward with similar stories. Brothers and sons thought dead who had survived in terrible circumstances, who had been too broken or too afraid to come home. The book didn't make them rich, but it did something more important. It gave Thomas's life meaning beyond survival. It turned his 70 years of silence into a voice that could help others. Maggie and Ruth donated the proceeds to organizations supporting Korean War veterans and families of MEAs. They gave interviews, spoke at veterans events, answered letters from families who'd lost loved ones and never gotten closure. Do you think he knew? Maggie asked Ruth one evening, sitting on Ruth's porch in San Francisco, watching the fog roll in over the bay. Do you think Tommy knew, before he died, that we really forgave him? I think so, Ruth said. I hope so. I wish we'd had more time. We had exactly the time we were supposed to have, Ruth said. 3 days. It wasn't enough, but it was everything. Maggie looked at the wooden carving of herself as a little girl. She kept it on her mantel now, next to photos of her own children and grandchildren. I used to be so angry. Angry at God for taking him. Angry at the government for sending him to war. Angry at Tommy for dying and leaving us. And now? Now I'm just grateful. Grateful we found out the truth. Grateful we got to say goodbye. Grateful that even though he was lost, he wasn't forgotten. Ruth reached over and took her sister's hand. They sat together in comfortable silence, two old women who'd survived childhood poverty, war, loss, long marriages, and the impossible miracle of finding their brother 70 years after they'd buried him. Do you think there are others? Maggie asked. Other families who think their loved ones died but who are actually still alive somewhere. Probably, Ruth said. The world is full of ghosts who aren't really dead. Just lost. Then we should help them, Maggie said with sudden conviction. We should use what we learned. Help other families find their ghosts. Ruth smiled. You want to become a detective at 78? Why not? We're not dead yet. Might as well do something useful. And so they did. Maggie and Ruth Chen became unlikely advocates for families of missing Korean War soldiers. They partnered with Frank Castellano's organization, using their story to raise awareness and funding. They pushed for more declassification of records. They traveled to Washington, D.C., to testify before congressional committees about the need for transparency regarding POWs and MIAs. They were featured in a documentary about Korean War veterans that aired on PBS. They spoke at high schools and colleges about their brother's story, about the cost of war, about the importance of never forgetting. And slowly, they helped other families find answers. There was the Martinez family in Texas, whose father had been listed as MIA in 1952. Through declassified records and persistent investigation, they discovered he'd died in a POW camp in 1954, confirmation after 70 years of uncertainty. There was the Johnson family in Michigan, whose uncle had supposedly defected to North Korea. They learned the truth: he'd been coerced, held against his will, and had died trying to escape in 1956. Not a traitor. A victim. There was the Kim family in Los Angeles, whose brother had disappeared during the Incheon landing. They found he'd been taken prisoner, survived the war, but died in a fishing accident in South Korea in 1967, never having made it home. At least they knew. Each family got a piece of closure. Each story added to the historical record. Each truth honored replaced a lie by omission. "We're not bringing people back," Maggie said during one interview. "We're just bringing back the truth. And sometimes, that's enough." 2 years after Thomas's death, Dorothy called with unexpected news. "I found more journals," she said. "Hidden in the attic. Thomas must have put them there years ago. Maggie, Ruth, there's something you need to see." They flew to West Virginia again, this time in spring when the mountains were green and alive. Dorothy met them at the farmhouse, looking older and more tired, but still strong. She led them to the attic, a cramped space filled with boxes and memories. "I was cleaning out Thomas's things," Dorothy explained. "Donated most of his clothes, organized his papers. Then I found this." She pulled out a showbox wrapped in plastic, protected against moisture and time. Inside were 3 more journals, older than the one they'd already published, dating back to the early 1960s. "I don't think he meant to hide them," Dorothy said. "I think he just forgot. Dementia, you know. He probably put them up here for safekeeping and then couldn't remember where they were." Ruth opened the first journal. The entries started in 1962, right after Thomas had returned to San Francisco and found his family gone. August 15, 1962. "I followed a woman today who looked like Ruth. Followed her for 6 blocks before I realized it wasn't her. She was maybe 30, the right age Ruth would be now. But when she turned around, her face was all wrong. Not my sister. Just a stranger who thought I was some creep following her. I'm losing my mind. I see my family everywhere. In every Chinese face in Chinatown, I see my mother. Every teenage girl could be Maggie. Every young woman might be Ruth. But none of them are. My family is gone, and I'm a ghost haunting the city where I grew up. Maybe I should leave. Go somewhere where there are no memories. Start over completely. Be someone new, since Thomas Chen is officially dead anyway." The entries continued, chronicling Thomas's struggle with PTSD, his attempts to find work, his loneliness, his slow breakdown and eventual decision to leave San Francisco. But then, in October 1962, there was an entry that made both sisters gasp. "I saw them today. I actually saw them. I was at the library on Mission Street, looking through phone books, trying one last time to find my family. And there, across the reading room, were 2 women. One looked about 30, one maybe 26. They were helping an elderly Chinese woman, their mother, obviously, find a book. The older one looked like Ruth. Same serious expression, same way of standing with her weight on one hip. The younger one laughed at something, and my heart stopped because it sounded exactly like Maggie used to laugh. I stood up. I was going to go to them. I was finally going to tell them, I'm alive. I'm here. I'm sorry. But then I looked down at myself. My clothes were worn and dirty. I hadn't shaved in a week. My hands were shaking. I looked like exactly what I was, a homeless veteran with PTSD, probably drunk, definitely crazy. And I thought, what would I say? How would I explain? Hi, I'm your dead brother, back from the grave, and I'm completely broken. Want to get coffee? I watched them for 20 minutes. Watched Ruth help the old woman with books about gardening. Watched Maggie laugh with the librarian about something. Watched them be alive and whole and functioning in the world. They looked happy. They looked like they'd moved on. They looked like they didn't need a ghost disrupting their lives. So I left. Walked out of the library and kept walking. By the time I stopped, I was in Oakland. I never went back. Maggie's hands were shaking so hard Ruth had to take the journal from her. He saw us, Maggie whispered. He was right there, and he saw us. October 1962, Ruth said slowly, thinking. Maggie, that was Mother. Remember? She wanted help finding a book about chrysanthemums for the garden. You and I took her to the mission library because it had a better Chinese section. We were right there, Maggie said, tears streaming down her face. We were in the same room with him. If he'd just said something. If he'd just. He was too broken, Dorothy said gently. Too afraid. Too convinced you were better off without him. Ruth was still reading. There's more. Listen to this. January 1963. I'm in Portland now. Got a job washing dishes at a diner. It's honest work. It keeps me busy. Keeps my hands occupied so they don't shake as much. I've made a decision. I'm not going to look for them anymore. I'm not going to try to go back. Thomas Chen died in Korea. That's the truth, even if my body kept walking around after. Someday, maybe, when I'm better, if I ever get better, I'll write to them. I'll explain everything. I'll ask for forgiveness. But not now. Not when I'm like this. Not when I have nothing to offer them but nightmares and grief. I'm sorry, Maggie. I'm sorry, Ruth. I'm sorry, Mama. I tried to come home. I really tried. But home doesn't exist anymore. Not for me. The entries in that journal continued through 1969, documenting Thomas's wanderings, his jobs, his struggles, his slow, incomplete healing. Each entry mentioned his sisters. Each one expressed love and regret in equal measure. The second journal covered 1970 to 1979, the years before he met Dorothy. Those entries were darker, more desperate. There were references to suicide attempts, to hospitalizations, to moments when Thomas had nearly given up completely. But there were also moments of hope. A counselor who actually helped. A fellow veteran who understood. Small jobs that gave him purpose. Gradually, painfully, Thomas had clawed his way back to something resembling a life. The third journal started in 1980 and ended in 1985. It chronicled meeting Dorothy, falling in love, deciding to stay in West Virginia, building a home. The final entry, dated December 1985, said, I'm happy. It feels strange to write that, but it's true. I'm happy. Dorothy and I got married today. Nothing official. Just the two of us and a justice of the peace. She doesn't care that I'm damaged. She doesn't care that I wake up screaming sometimes. She just loves me. I wish my sisters could be here. I wish they could meet Dorothy. I wish they could know I'm alive and that I finally found some peace. But they can't know, because Thomas Chen is dead. He died in Korea in 1953. And maybe that's okay. Maybe that's how it has to be. Still, I hope wherever they are, Maggie and Ruth are happy too. I hope they have families and good lives. I hope they've forgiven me for dying. I haven't forgiven myself. But maybe someday I will. Maggie and Ruth sat in Dorothy's living room, the three journals spread before them like evidence in a trial where everyone was both guilty and innocent. He was so close, Maggie said. At the library. We were right there. Would it have been better if he'd approached you? Dorothy asked gently. If he'd revealed himself then? When he was still so broken? Ruth considered this. No. Probably not. We wouldn't have understood. We would have been angry. Confused. We would have wanted explanations he couldn't give. It would have been traumatic. For everyone. But we could have helped him, Maggie insisted. Could you? Dorothy asked. Honestly, in 1962, PTSD wasn't even recognized. Shell shock, combat fatigue, they had names for it, but no treatment. No understanding. If Thomas had come to you then, what would you have done? Maggie thought about it. She'd been 26 in 1962, newly married, pregnant with her first child. What would she have done if her supposedly dead brother had appeared, traumatized and broken? Would she have had the resources, the knowledge, the emotional capacity to help him? Probably not. Maybe the timing worked out exactly as it was supposed to, Ruth said slowly. He wasn't ready in 1962. We weren't ready. But in 2023, when Dorothy sent that photograph, we were all ready. We were old enough to understand. Wise enough to forgive. We had 3 days. Together, and they were good days. Maybe that's the only version of this story where everyone got what they needed. Even though we lost 70 years. Maggie asked. Even though, Ruth confirmed. Because those 70 years allowed Thomas to heal enough to face us. Allowed us to mature enough to understand. Sometimes the long way around is the only way that works. Dorothy wiped her eyes. He loved you so much. That's what you need to know. Every day of those 70 years, he loved you. He carried you with him. You were why he survived. And he survived, Maggie said. That's what matters. He survived the war, the camps, the trauma, all of it. He survived and he found love and he had some happiness. That's not nothing. That's everything, Ruth agreed. They published the new journals as a sequel, The Ghost Brother Returns, The Lost Years. This book filled in the gaps, showed the reality of PTSD before it had a name, documented one veteran's struggle to rebuild a life after unimaginable trauma. It became required reading in several veterans' counseling programs. It was used in college courses about war literature and trauma studies. It helped people understand that coming home from war isn't always a happy ending. Sometimes it's just the beginning of a different kind of battle. Maggie and Ruth continued their advocacy work, but they also made peace with the past. They visited Thomas's grave twice a year, bringing flowers and sitting with Dorothy, sharing stories and memories. They framed the wooden carvings he'd made and donated them to a Korean War museum, along with his journals and letters. They established the Thomas Chen Memorial Scholarship for Chinese American veterans and their families. They lobbied successfully for a memorial in San Francisco's Chinatown honoring Korean War veterans from the neighborhood. And they forgave their parents. It took time and therapy and many long conversations, but eventually they came to understand that their parents had done what they thought was best. They'd buried their son, mourned him, and moved on because that's what you did in 1953. You didn't question the government. You didn't demand proof. You just believed what you were told and tried to survive your grief. They did the best they could, Maggie said at her mother's grave, 50 years after her death. They loved us. They loved Tommy. They just didn't know he was still alive to love. 5 years after finding Thomas, Maggie received one final surprise. A letter arrived from South Korea, from a man named Kim Sung-ho. He wrote in careful English, "Dear Mrs. Chen, I read your book about your brother Thomas Chen. I must tell you something important. I was in the POW camp with your brother in 1953. I was a South Korean soldier captured by the Chinese. We were in the same barracks for 2 months. Your brother saved my life. I was sick with dysentery, dying. The guards didn't care. But Thomas gave me his food rations. He snuck me medicine. He talked to me in Korean, he had learned some from other prisoners, and told me not to give up. When the prisoner exchange happened, I was repatriated. Thomas was not. I never knew what happened to him. For 70 years, I wondered if he survived. If he made it home. If he remembered the Korean soldier he saved. Now I know. And I want you to know that your brother was a hero. Not because he fought well or killed the enemy. But because he remained human in a place designed to destroy humanity. He saved me, and I went on to have a wife, 3 children, 7 grandchildren. All because of Thomas Chen. I'm sorry he suffered so much. I'm sorry he couldn't come home. But I want his family to know, he mattered. He made a difference. He is not forgotten. With deepest respect, Kim Sung-ho. Maggie read the letter 3 times, then called Ruth. He saved someone, she said, her voice thick with tears. All those years we thought he died for nothing, and he saved someone. Someone who went on to have a whole family, a whole life. That sounds like Tommy, Ruth said softly. He always took care of people. Remember how he used to share his lunch with the neighborhood kids who didn't have enough? How he'd give his jacket to anyone who looked cold? That was who he was. Who he stayed, Maggie corrected. Even in a POW camp. Even when he was broken. He stayed kind. He stayed human. That's the real story, Ruth said. Not that he survived. That he survived and stayed himself. Maggie Chen died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 84, 6 years after finding her brother. Ruth spoke at her funeral, telling the story of 2 sisters who'd lost their brother and found him again 70 years later. Who'd learned that love doesn't die when people do. That some bonds can't be broken by time or distance or even death. My sister spent 70 years missing our brother, Ruth said. But those last 6 years, from the moment that photograph arrived until the day she died, she spent being grateful. Grateful for 3 days with Tommy. Grateful for understanding. Grateful for closure. Grateful that love, even when it seems lost, can always be found again. Ruth lived another 4 years, dying at 89, still sharp-minded and fierce until the end. Before she died, she finished one last book, a memoir about her and Maggie's relationship, about sisterhood and loss and how finding Thomas had healed something in both of them they hadn't realized was broken. She titled it We Found Him, a story of faith, family, and forever love. The dedication read, for Thomas, who taught us that survival is its own kind of heroism. For Maggie, who never stopped believing in miracles. For Dorothy, who loved a ghost until he became real again. And for all the families still searching, don't give up. Sometimes the lost can be found. Years later, a young woman named Sarah Chen, Thomas and Dorothy's granddaughter, stood in front of a Korean War memorial in Washington, D.C. She was 28, a documentary filmmaker, and she was making a film about her grandfather's story. About the families of Mias and POWs. About the long shadow war casts and how some people spend their whole lives trying to come home. She'd interviewed Dorothy before she died. She'd read all of Thomas's journals, all of Maggie and Ruth's books. She'd tracked down Kim Sung-ho in South Korea and filmed his testimony. She'd gathered photos, letters, military records, and woven them into a story about love and loss and the impossible miracle of reunion. The film was called The Ghost Brother, and it had just been accepted to the Sundance Film Festival. Standing at the memorial, reading the names of the fallen and missing, Sarah thought about her grandfather. About the boy who'd gone to war and the broken man who'd come back. About the 70 years he'd spent being dead while alive. About the 3 days he'd spent reunited with his sisters before dementia took him away again. It wasn't a happy story. But it wasn't entirely sad either. It was a human story. A true story. A story about the cost of war and the power of love and the fact that sometimes, against all odds, the lost can be found. Sarah placed her hand on the memorial wall, on the section where her grandfather's name had finally been added, not among the dead, but among the returned. A survivor. A ghost who'd become real again. A brother who'd been lost and found. I'll tell your story, Grandpa, she whispered. I'll make sure people remember. Not just what you lost, but what you survived. Not just how you suffered, but how you loved. Behind her, the sun set over the Capitol, casting long shadows across the memorial. And somewhere, in that space between memory and history, between loss and love, between the living and the dead, 3 siblings walked together again. Not as they'd been, young and whole and innocent. But as they'd become, old and scarred and wise. Together. Finally. Forever. The Ghost Brother is a reminder that war doesn't end when the fighting stops. That some soldiers spend their whole lives trying to come home. That families carry losses for generations. But it's also a reminder that love endures. That truth matters. That it's never too late for reunion, forgiveness, and peace. And that sometimes, against all odds, the dead can return, not as they were, but as they've become. And that's enough. That's everything.